Okay, today's webinar is on formulating research questions. We will have some basics, techniques, and practical examples. And we hope that after the webinar, you will have a better understanding on how to frame research questions. The webinar today consists of 8 sections. We will start with what is the question, followed by selection criteria for questions, getting some insights into the development and evolution of research questions, and what do we do with answered questions. Yes, you read this correctly. We will look into this too. Why it can be hard to craft research questions, learn how question framing can be a structured process, and towards the end, we will look into some example research questions, and we will close it with a new activity to our webinars, which is a breakout session, which allows for group reflections on how you framed your research questions. So this provides you with a smaller floor to discuss in groups about any questions that you might still have. And with this, so what is the question? Now, this, in accordance to IBM, is actually a good question, because the research questions do not pop out of the blue, but they emerge from the purpose of our research. So the question is then, what do we want to explore? If we want to see already something related to the essence of hoarseness, possible questions that could emerge is, what is the essence of hoarseness? Where is there information about hoarseness? And what, anyway, is hoarseness? So, depending on what you are up for, the question might look very different. So then, what are selection criteria for research questions? As said, it will depend on what we are seeking. Now, this example is taken from a faculty research group that engaged in a collaborative process on settling their research agenda. They started with this simple metrics file, where on the left side you see the domain and on the right side the focus. So the focus of the research in this case could have been theory, method, or tools, depending on how the faculty would want to shape their research agenda. Now, based on that, they went into a subdomain, which is users in context, and therefore were able to be more specific on what they might want to be looking at. From a theoretical perspective, they might look at user dimensions, cognitive context, social context, cultural context, and so forth. So you see, you can break down the questions and the focus as more precisely as you narrow down the perspective on what you're looking for. So what do we want to know then? In accordance to that, once we are clear what we want to know, we can select a suitable question. Now, in this case, for example, if you ask a who question, it would be about identification, audiences, or users. Or to those of you that are more from a qualitative research perspective, the why question is clearly one of the questions that needs to be considered, which is looking about reasons, about causes and effects, about purposes. So if you engage in any sort of root cause analysis, then a why question certainly needs to be considered. So what do we want to know? And why is there a we anyway in the equation? Who is it who is defining the question? Is it the researcher? Is it the literature? Or is it perhaps a research problem? Or is it the knowledge gap around the research problem? Now, depending on any of those, the questions might look very different. But from this source, I do understand that research questions are emergent. So they are not brought up at one point in time, but they emerge over time. Initial questions are often very vague. They are perhaps politically too correct. They are ideological. They might be driven purely by our outcome expectations. So, how do research questions then develop and evolve over time? If I'm going too fast, you will be provided with a slide set afterwards, so you can read in detail through all of the slides if you wish to. Now, perhaps it's important to say that the research questions are amongst the last thing to be written up in your thesis. Now, but while they are amongst the last thing to become final in the thesis, they are certainly also at the very beginning. The type of question and the purpose why you ask that question is, however, very different. At the beginning, questions are more geared towards understanding what is happening here, why something is not working, or why one thing is working but another not. So as you collect data, the purpose of the question changes. Because at this point in time, you then start looking into what is the data telling me about the problems that I might have not considered at the start. So the questions then look into what can the data answer and how is this matching. And this is a very common point in time where things start to not add up. The questions that you were asking are not to be answered with the data you have been collecting. Now, this is nothing uncommon, but something that can be seen very often, and perhaps it's a part of the research process. And then the question is it the question or is it the answer? Perhaps your data is telling you something very meaningful. However, the question is not really extracting it. So from this perspective, you should look more open into your data to understand what is the real question to what the data is answering. This can be a daunting process and it can take some time, as we will see, for example, here. This is an example of a very early question, which is what factors affect consumer choices between disposables and durables. So you can see factors is still a very vague word. Consumers, whom do we really mean here? And disposables and durables clearly need definition. As you go further, you manage to be more precise in your questioning because you can draw on the knowledge that has emerged, be it either from the literature or also from the data you have been collecting. So in this case, what personal values affect consumer purchase between products of diverse lifespans, an example, single use through permanent use. So it's already much more precise. And as your research continues, you will see that you at one point in time, and this is perhaps the end state, manage to be as precise as in this example. How do expressed attitudes on environmental responsibility correspond to actual behavior regarding the purchase of single-use through permanent use products? Now, this type of question and this type of specificity you only will manage to reach once you have data at hand that allows you to single out and identify those parameters. Is so far things are still clear, or are there any questions at this point in time? Okay. Then let's move into the next section. What do we do with answered questions? I would have assumed it's quite obvious. Now, however, having worked with a couple of hundreds of students, I realized that not unfrequently, it's like, yeah, understood, fine, let's take that out of the thesis. Let's look into those things that are still not clear. Now, if we would apply this approach to our research, very unlikely the thesis ever will fill. Because at one point in time, we will have understood, quite frankly, most of it. So it's not that those things that you have answered are out of the thesis. No, it's rather that they are at the core of your thesis. So the analysis that led to answering those questions should be in the analysis section, while the answered question perhaps should be in the findings question. Now, as said, it seems to be very simple, but looking at students' works, that seems to be a tricky thing. So please be aware, just because you have something understood doesn't mean it's out of the thesis. So now, why can it be hard to frame research questions? There are a number of reasons why this can be hard. For once, the question perhaps is simply wrong. Now, we might be interested in something and therefore asking a particular question with an outcome expectation view. However, the question is not related to the problem. So there's no relation. There are a number of things where the question just simply could be wrong. But to make things even more complex, there are many questions out that are just simply faulty, and people often don't see it. There are well-established scientists that still perhaps ask wrong questions, and this is now not putting blame on them, it's just the nature of the research. We talked about it earlier, is it the question or is it the answer? So if research gets published, perhaps at this point in time, there is still a question-answer mismatch, and only at a later point in time, it becomes clear that actually the data is answering something very different, and therefore the question should be changed. So this is obviously a tricky thing, in particular, if you're a research student just working towards your doctorate. Whom can you trust and whom can you follow? Well, I think it's important that you learn to question the question. It is something that is inherent to science, and critical evaluation can help you as much as reflection with peers. Further to this, and as we are there, do you understand, by the way, what a research problem is? Let us look into the right example. An excellent way to form general research questions begins with the information gaps the decision maker and researcher identified earlier when discussing the decision problem. Recall that information gaps are simply the difference between what a decision maker currently knows and would like to know about a problem in order to make a decision. For example, in one recent project for this class, the problem that faced the decision maker was simply, what must I do to increase my sales to $1 million annually? Now, if I would have put out this as an example in a course or once working with students, it is not uncommon that you see that the student immediately jumps on what must I do to increase my sales to $1 million annually. Reason being, this is an exciting question. It asks for a clear outcome, making $1 million, and therefore you're motivated to answer that question. However, in this case, the real problem is a problem about decision making and not how to make $1 million. So I think it's very important to understand the difference in between a problem and a solution, and to look into the literature and into the data rather with a problem view and not a solution view, and to derive the question from there. And this is exactly the relationship between problem, research question, and outcome expectation. And the tricky thing here is that at the beginning of the research, the outcome expectation of what you want to achieve with your research is much clearer to you than the problem. And therefore, questions are always biased towards the solution rather than to the problem. However, being aware about this might allow you to take out such bias. With this, we come into section 6, research question framing being a structured process. Thankfully, there are many guides out that help you in approaching the research questions in a more structured way. And from a very simple perspective, I think it should be made clear that the research question is of interest to the researcher, because you will spend many months or years with it. So you should tackle a problem that is of relevance and urgency. Having said that, it shouldn't be too urgent, because if it's too urgent, you're mainly interested in solving it, therefore hastily jumping into this direction. And the question should be researchable. It should be based on earlier study, and it should be something that can be measured, supported, or contradicted. And last but not least, a question must be actionable. Actionable in the simplest form means it must be able to be acted upon. And as we are there, questioning should be based on concrete observations, not abstract or speculative. In particular, if we go back to the solution versus problem view, if you see something exciting, you speculate often about things, how they could be or how they could become. And then from those speculations, questions do emerge. Now, you might want to refrain from being too creative here, but just simply answer the question, what is a research problem? Do you have an answer to it or not? If you have an answer to it, then simply what is it that is still not known? And if you have no answer to it, then you might want to drill down to the root to understand what is a good entry research question. We talked about data earlier and how data can help us framing the question. And indeed, there's a relationship in between the question, the coding, and the answer. Or, as this case shows, what 3 words best describe France? Now, you unlikely would come up with the answer cheese, wine, and rubbish if you don't hold that information. Once you hold that information, the question is easily to be extracted. And more general, research questions should be focused, specific, complex, analytical, and unbiased. And you might want to choose an interesting general topic, and some preliminary research might help you and guide you. And I think to most of the research in the social sciences, and perhaps more generally also valid, you might want to consider and engage with the audience, because it's not that the best research questions come up from your mind alone or from you consulting the literature. This should ideally be a collaborative process and perhaps under engagement of those to whom the problem relates. This also will produce some initial set of data, even if not usable to your thesis, because you still haven't getting ethical clearance, but still you can use it. So towards making the question more precise. So engagement is critical for this. With this, we move into the final part of this webinar and look into some example research questions and how research questions look like, or better not look like. Now, what is the evidence for claims made about listening behavior, listening processes, and listening barriers in the popular technical and academic literatures? Now, would you consider this being a good or a not so good question? Now, what is only asking for collecting data, and is it not clear what the data is needed for, or what is the purpose of the gathering? So this is perhaps a question that shall not be asked. And let's look into another possible question. What should theories of listening look like? What sort of terms ought they to contain? And what are the specific components of good listening theory? Now, we combine here a number of things that perhaps are not combinable, or at least not obviously combinable. And we ask for speculation about a solution. So I think questions should refrain from doing that too. And what is the meaning of good anyway? Good, perfect, best. How do we measure all of those things? Let's look into another example question. What theories exist to explain listening, broadly speaking, and how well do they stand to empirical scrutiny? So again, and how would we be measuring that? And aren't we looking here at 2 questions, and how do those 2 relate to each other? Now, this again is something that perhaps is not a good question to be followed. Let's look at something else. Research statement. Our proposed project seeks to overcome this barrier by addressing the following actionable research question. How can existing data and insight into the policy process be leveraged to inform decision-making on where and how to intervene to effectively shift multiple axes of food systems towards enhancing the sustainability of diets? Now, as a matter of fact, this question comes with a very different problem. This is a question that was not made to be a research question. This question was fabricated to be pushed into either a journal publication or into a funding proposal. So the target audience of this question is not really in conducting a research study, but it is to present a final piece of research to a specific target audience. Now, if you are provided with this type of question and you're a research student still, and you want to pick up on that, you will unfortunately find out at one point in time that this is not an actionable question. So be careful to also understand in which context research questions that you read have been asked and what is the target audience of such. Now, in the closing, to wrap it up and to move further, to those that want to learn more about how to frame research question, we do have a specific training course on that at our website. And in 4 to 8 weeks from now, we will release all of our courses under as free self-study courses with peer support. So watch out our website. That should come soon, and it will allow you to take this course for free under a self-study mode. And you're very much invited in engaging in this course. With this, I like to come to the ending of the recording.